Today, we're going to talk about the events that led up to the Revolutionary War. It says, April 19th, 1775 marked the end of an era. So first of all, let's talk about what is an era? An era is a long and distinct period of history with a particular feature or characteristic. And in our instance here, what's being ended in that era is the British rule over the American colonies. So let's go ahead and read about it now. April 19th, 1775 marked the end of an era. At dawn that day, British troops fired on American colonists in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. This was the beginning of the American Revolution. The war started as a fight for the rights of English people in Britain's 13 American colonies, but those people soon declared and won their independence from Britain. They created a new nation called the United States of America. The Founders. Many people made American independence possible. A group of them are known as the Founders of the United States. The best known founders are George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton. George Washington led the American military forces, the Continental Army, to victory over the British. He later became the first president of the United States. John Adams was the strongest supporter of American independence. He became the first vice president of the United States and its second president. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Americans' Declaration of Independence. He became the nation's third president. Benjamin Franklin was the oldest of the founders. He was 70 years old when the Declaration of Independence was signed. Franklin helped to get France to become an ally of the United States. Both during and after the Revolution, Alexander Hamilton urged Americans to form a stronger union of the states. This is why these gentlemen are known as the Founding Fathers of the United States. Britain established its first colony in North America in 1607. By the early 1760s, there were 13 colonies. These were Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Virginia. Notice that even though the names stayed the same, the actual states, which at the time were colonies, did not match up with what we have today. About 1.5 million colonists lived in these colonies. The colonies were far away from Britain, and they were used to running their own affairs. Each had its own assembly, they ran the everyday business of the colonies, they collected taxes, and Britain rarely taxed the Americans. But then the French and Indian War happened from 1754 to 1763, and that changed it. Britain won the war against France, but the war was costly, and Britain owed a lot of money. And Britain also needed money to keep its army up in North America. So therefore, the British government decided to tax the Americans. This started out with the British Parliament, which is like the British government, passed the Stamp Act of 1765. This taxed their newspapers and almost everything else that was printed. This angered the colonists. Why, they asked, should we pay taxes to Britain? The colonists decided to fight against the taxes. Representatives of 9 of the colonies met in New York in 1765. They formed the Stamp Act Congress. It said that the colonists should boycott, which means to refuse to buy British goods. Groups called the Sons of Liberty also fought against British taxes. They often used violence against British tax collectors. The colonist opposition, which means they refused to pay the taxes, forced the Parliament to repeal or withdraw the Stamp Act. This made the colonists aware of their power. Other British attempts to impose new taxes only made things worse. Boston was the center of the opposition to Britain's tax policies. In 1770, a raggedy crowd of people taunted some British soldiers. The frightened soldiers shot into the crowd, killing 5 Americans. The Boston Massacre is what it was called, and this led to a new boycott. Parliament didn't have much choice. It gave in again. It removed all taxes except for one on tea. Now remember, drinking tea was something that they did daily back then. It was the most popular drink in the colonies, so the Americans were outraged. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. They threw the cargoes of tea overboard, and this action became known as the Boston Tea Party. They did this because they were refusing to pay the tea tax, and they were proving a point to Britain. The British Parliament then passed 4 harsh measures in 1774. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. The acts closed the port of Boston. They took away many of the Massachusetts rights of self-government, and they allowed British troops to be housed in private homes. These measures only served to unite the colonists. More and more of them felt that their basic liberties were at stake. In 1774, representatives of all the colonies, except Georgia, met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. They tried to get Britain to resolve the issues peacefully, but they were ready to fight if it became necessary. The American Revolution is also called the Revolutionary War and the American War of Independence. The first shots of that war were fired on April 19, 1775. British troops were in Lexington, Massachusetts, searching for hidden arms or guns. Waiting for the British were 77 Minutemen. They were colonists who were trained to be ready in a minute. No one knows who fired first, but 8 Americans were killed. That same day, British and American soldiers fought again at nearby Concord. The news spread throughout the colonies, which quickly prepared for war. This is why it was called the shot heard round the world, because news of the war starting spread so very quickly. But not all colonists were ready for a complete break with Britain. Hundreds of thousands were still loyal to Britain and its king. They opposed or were against independence. They were known as Loyalists or Tories. Hundreds of thousands of other colonists were neutral. They were not sure if they wanted a complete break with Britain. Please watch this next section to understand Loyalists and Patriots a little bit better.
Today we're going to start by talking about Loyalists and Patriots. Loyalists were those people who remained loyal to the king, while Patriots were those who wanted independence from the king. This sounds like a great spot to do a compare and contrast. Both groups were colonists. Loyalists and Patriots were those living in the colonies. They just had different opinions on who should be winning the war. Most Loyalists worked for the king or benefited from the status quo or things remaining the same, while the Patriots, they tended to lead boycotts and protests to try to make change happen. Both of these groups faced harassment if they lived in an area dominated by the other side. Patriots, most had to fight in the army, while the Loyalists, only some had to because the British army was well trained and they had plenty of soldiers. Both tried to convince others to join, although the Loyalists started giving up and going back to Britain, while the Patriots were led by the Sons of Liberty and the Continental Congress. So 2 very different sides of these groups involved in the Revolutionary War, both of their reasons why they believed what they believed and did what they did.
The question of independence was finally decided at the Second Continental Congress. That Congress began in Philadelphia on May 1775, the month after the fighting had started. At first, the delegates were just divided as the rest of the colonists. They debated the issue for more than a year. Finally, the delegates adopted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. It declared that the 13 colonies were free and independent states from Britain. The Congress decided to create a Continental Army, and it picked George Washington to lead it. In addition, it adopted the Articles of the Confederation. This created a confederation or a loose union of the 13 states. The Articles also set up a legislature called Congress of the Confederation. The Congress was the central government of the Confederation. So during all of this, the American Revolutionary War was going on. Let's take a peek at what each side had going for them. The Patriots, which were the colonists, and Britain. Just to help you out here, Britain were called also the Redcoats because they had red fancy uniforms, whereas the Patriots, they were farmers and everyday people, so they wore whatever they had.
On the battlefield, these two groups changed into the British and American armies, which were very different in their advantages and disadvantages. Let's take a look at these two sides with this versus that. Today, with this versus that, we have on one side the American army, and on the other side, the British army, both with their strengths and weaknesses. Let's start by taking a look at the strengths of the American army. First, there was home field advantage. The Americans knew where they were going and how to get there. Unlike the British, they knew where to get help. They could recruit new troops from across the countryside. The British, on the other hand, were thousands of miles away from home. They had to get troops, mostly from Britain, as most loyalists were not trained to fight in the King's army. Of course, one of the strengths of the British was their navy, which was the most powerful in the world. The U.S. never really had a navy to speak of. But luckily for the Americans, they would get help from France, who had the second largest navy in the world to help win the war. Now, when the British were running low on their soldiers, they had their wealth to hire some more. They chose to hire the Hessians, the most notorious mercenaries in the world. The British didn't need this very often, however, because they had lots of well-trained soldiers and all the supplies they needed. American soldiers were not well-trained and lacked food and supplies until the war ended. What Americans did have was a brilliant leader in George Washington. He may have lost some battles, but he won the ones that mattered and inspired his men. The leaders of the British Army were well-trained and knowledgeable, but they underestimated the Americans time and time again. Of course, being a British officer wasn't the easiest job in the world. Your soldiers were only fighting for a paycheck. The Americans, on the other hand, were fighting for families, homes, and ultimately their freedom.
There were many battles that went on in the American Revolution. Starting in 1778, the British focused their efforts on the southern colonies. In the Carolinas and Virginia, British General Charles Cornwallis defeated the Americans in one battle after another. The situation there seemed hopeless. Then the French came to the rescue. General Rochambeau and some 5,000 French troops arrived in 1780, and a French fleet arrived in 1781. At that time, General Cornwallis had an army of more than 6,000 British troops at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington led his American and French troops there. For the first time in the war, Washington had a larger military force than the British. Yorktown was the last major battle of the war. Peace talks began in Paris, France in 1782. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783. The new nation had been tested on the battlefield. Now the war was over. For the first time, Britain recognized the United States of America as an independent country.